So that's this is going to be the convex.
Yes.
Okay. Is there a printout or something? Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right. How you doing, man? Doing pretty good. Okay. What about you? You don't stop. See you later. Oh, this is how you. Beautiful.
So far. Next, how are you? Download or get materials from you back?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Good job. Good, there you go. Good.
Hey,
How are you today?
good, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Thank you for being here instead of being on the beaches at spring break. Wherever it is you go for spring break. I was interesting that while places like Corpus and Padre Island are looking forward to the spring break and the people coming in. At some place, I think it was, they were talking about it in Miami, was kind of discouraging it. I don't know, if it's because of challenges they've had or whatever. Does everybody have some materials in the back as you work through this? Now, this is a continuation of the dirty tricks and negotiation that we started last month. And with a lot of great questions and comments and so forth, and lots of conversations, we decided that we needed to devote more time to the topic. So we've brought it forward to today. You don't have to have been in the class last month to benefit from the class today. Is work through this, because each technique, each paragraph, each part of the contract and the addenda all follow the same things. It will be helpful, and I'll just kind of go over briefly on the first page of your handout where it talks about the dirty tricks. And remember, and when we look at dirty tricks, we want to understand the dirty tricks of negotiation, because why? Why do we even look at this?
And we can prevent it.
Yeah, so you know when it's being played on you. And sometimes one of the hardest things to do is determine whether there's an intent for somebody to play it on you. You know, like an obvious example, you've got a buyer and that's a really good piece of property. And the listing agent tells you, you know what, you better really come with a great offer because we got other offers. And that might be a dirty trick. That may just be creating a sense of urgency, may or may not be true. And by the way, hello Zoomers. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So we've got a few Zoomers there. Thank you for being here. And so it's hard because sometimes dirty tricks are done accidentally. I mean, they're done just because the people are incompetent and they do something that kind of looks like a dirty trick. And when the reality is, they don't know what they're doing. When you get an offer sometimes, and there are things that offer that you go, wow, are they trying to pull one on me or they just don't know what they're doing? You'll see things in blanks. You'll see some blanks just blank and some information. You know, and one of the things that we'll kind of touch on, we really didn't talk about it when we were talking about paragraph 3 last month, but because of some things that are happening in the marketplace, we're more sensitive than we probably have ever been on fraudulent sellers and fraudulent buyers. Not people that are just pulling dirty tricks, but people are committing fraud. We've got 2 right now in this office. One in my Rockwall office. All of them are getting resolved, but The two here, both are fraudulent sellers. And these show up most often, be sure and get documents, in fact, if you have downloaded. Most often this deals with acreage, vacant lots, vacant properties. And the challenge is, like one we just had here, when we had the listing. Representing the seller, we had IDs, everything matched the tax roll. I mean, everything was looking good. It was a seller that was out of area and was not available and we never met the seller. And we didn't really discover that this seller in our listing agreement was not the actual owner of the property until our agent put a sign in the yard. And this was a vacant lot, a nice lot up in Frisco. And what happened is the actual owner of that lot, who was out of state, Arkansas, his brother lives next door. And Bruce said, "You should have told me that you're selling a lot. When did this?" And I said, "What are you talking about? I'm not selling a lot." And that's how we discovered it. That's how we were able to go through the process and then try to get some additional information and go through it. So we're starting to, especially looking for those kind of pink flags, those kind of little things where it's something like acreage, it's a lot, it's a vacant property. It's someone who you don't get to meet, who's someone that's out of area, and especially someone who is willing to sell cheap and sell fast. Yes, ma'am.
So did you say that the taxes match the name of?
Matt, he actually sent an ID that matched. He had fraudulent IDs. He was ready to go to closing with fraudulent documents. And by the way, that happened to us in Rockwall 2 years ago, where the seller actually went to closing with fraudulent documents. And it was just by sheer luck that we were able to determine this was not a legitimate deal, and the title company had really begun to back off, refused to close it. But these people are getting clever. We are such targets. And Mike, I'm sure you see this nationally and things going on. This has been an increased trend. I mean, this is one of those things that, we've always been vulnerable at some level, but in the last year, we've seen a significant increase. And as I talk to people at the title company and I talk to my broker friends, every one of them has had it. Every one of them has had one or two in the last year. And most of them have said, fortunately, we found out before. But I mean, you are a listing agent. You're spending time, energy, money, put a sign in the yard, you got a listing, you're moving forward, you're advertising. And all of a sudden you find out that it's, fast has been pulled on. And it's a real challenge. So we just have to be a little more careful, be a little more respectfully assertive. I mean, we don't want to run any good business off, but we also don't want to spend our time, energy, and money on somebody that's not real. And that's why I'm frankly, maybe they finally discovered how easy we are. And we are, as an industry, we're easy. I'm frankly surprised it hadn't happened more often. And maybe this is where everybody said, wow, let's don't go out and rob banks. Let's just do this, just look how easy this is. And just like this guy who did the one here in agent, fraudulent seller. And, we finally said, hey, whoa. The chance of catching that guy, slim to none. I mean, he's out of state. Some of them are even out of country. And it's just, we just have to be more careful because your time is valuable and your efforts are valuable. And as we represent to the marketplace, here's a property and we represent the seller and here's the deal. That needs to be the case. So, and this gets into all the dirty trick stuff. Sometimes people are intentionally fraudulent. There's almost no way to protect against the big lie. They're really good at it. They've got all the docs and everything. And many of them are really slick at that. It's a challenge as you work through that, but we look through those things. So when we go through and we look here on page 1 of the handout, and we look at the 3 things: the lying, intentional misinformation, manipulation, and inappropriate use of emotions. The real key, and as I talk about further down on this, the real key to these that are the basis for dirty tricks is what's behind it. Is it those people are just, that's how they are, and we all know somebody. I mean, I used to have a colleague who's since He's going back to Vegas, which is where he was raised. If there was a sneaky, tricky way to do a deal, he'd prefer that over a legitimate, even if a legitimate deal made him more money. That was just his mindset. That was just how, there's people like that. And so there are some people who are doing things because that's just the way they are. And you need to discover as soon as you can, that's who they are. That's their intent as they're working through it. And then you need to discover if it's accidental, if they're doing this because they don't know what they're doing. There's still a risk there. There's still danger as we look at some of the paragraphs, as we continue forward from paragraph 6 moving forward. We'll see the things that might happen or might be there that we need to watch for to protect our client as we work through that. Because the hardest thing to determine in all of this is the intent. By far, I mean, it's really hard. And you know, sometimes it's your set of experiences with somebody that helps you say, I've been down that road with this guy before. So you kind of say, let them pull that. So as we go through where we kind of stop, if you may or may not remember, as I remember, as we went through, we had worked through paragraph 5, and if you got anything, paragraph 5, was a huge paragraph. A lot of room for abuse in paragraph 5, which deals with the earnest money option. As we moved from that, and we talked about, you know, some of the dirty tricks. Just for example, the concept of making what's otherwise a good offer without an option. Now, on one hand, tell a listing agent who's not well trained, not been in our classes, say, wow, what a great offer. They're not even got this easy way to get out. This is great. That's a committed buyer. Well, maybe not. You know, when you look at other things going on in the contract and you sit there and go, you know, there is a mandatory HOA here. And they can get out under that for any reason, 3 days after they get the information. Or, you know, we really haven't gotten the seller disclosure notice to them yet. So they checked off 7B2, which says they don't have the seller disclosure notice. That's a 7-day free option period. So giving up that option period may mean nothing, except it may lead the seller to believe, hey, boy, and the listing agent, this is a really good committed buyer. In fact, it may not be. So just having the absence of that in and of itself may be something that's pulled on you. And you need to really look at it as the listing agent and say, you know, what does this really mean to my seller? Some sellers say, you know what, frankly, I was expecting a couple $100 of an option for you to help me with this or that or whatever, or even more than that. When this was hot and heavy, Mike helped me with remembering the number. There was a huge number of an option fee that we had here. Seemed like it was like 20,000 or something. It was a big number.
It wasn't here. It's a agent or broker I knew in Park Cities. It was
Okay.
1 million.
How much?
1 million.
Wow. Now, that could be a dirty trick. Because the reality is, seller may accept that offer over any other offer. And yet the buyer doesn't have to pay it. All they do is they lose that termination option. But they've got into a contract with the seller who says, man, look at this. This is a great contract. I get $1 million. It's really tricky when the property's only worth 900,000. But that can be a real dirty trick, a huge number like that, because people were using that. In the old contract, the option fee now in the current contract is automatically credited to the sales price. In the old contract, you had 2 boxes where you could check off if it was credited sales price or not. And you were having buyers pay smaller option fees, say $500, and checking off that it's not credited to the sales price, which means the buyer just paid a $500 bribe to the seller to accept their offer. Because the seller gets that $500 period regardless, because in that contract, not only was not credited sales price, it was paid directly to the seller, not to the title company like we have in the current contract. And so they were literally using that to get into a contract. And little things like that can cause your seller to feel really good about something until you explain to them, well, here's what that really means. Here's what's really going on here. So you've got to help them go through that process, because sometimes people will do those things and it's they may not even know how sneaky or tricky they're being, but we have to understand sense is how does this affect our client? Either side, whichever side we may be on. So in paragraph 5, a lot of room there, a lot of room for abuse as you're working through it. So we need to understand that payment of the earnest money and all that. So we're now on that page in the handout where at the top it says paragraph 5. And towards the bottom of it, we get into paragraph 6. So we look at the title policy and survey, and we talked about, we had a little bit of a conversation about paragraph 6A8, which is the survey exception. And I'm happy to go through any more conversation about that if you have any questions on it. Because this is one of those things that is certainly important for a buyer to do this if they're receiving an existing survey. Because if the buyer gets an existing survey and there's any mistake on the survey, they have nowhere to go unless they've omitted this exception. Because they can't go to the surveyor because it wasn't made for them. So on an existing survey, if they don't follow your advice and they go to existing survey, and they certainly ought to amend this and create an exception. So if there are mistakes on a survey that the title company, nobody knew about it prior to closing, then they can file a claim. Whether they win or not, it's a different conversation, but at least they can file a claim. And that's kind of an important thing in dealing with that. Any questions on the 6A8 thing and how we deal with that in the transaction before we go to the sneaky thing of the survey in 6C1? So in 6C1, you've got 3 choices. I mean, in 6C, you've got 3 choices, 6C1, 2, and 3. 6C1 is the one that deals with an existing survey. And what we find that happens in 6C1 is that you'll sometimes have a seller who has a survey, and so they accept an offer with 6C1, and they look at the 2 boxes of 6C1, and they see that the buyer has graciously checked off buyer. So if they have to have a new survey, then the buyer's going to pay for it. So I said, well, that's a good thing. You know, that's kind of nice that they've done that. But that's not what that really means. And it's not what really ends up happening. Because the 2 boxes are only tied to the seller providing a survey, as he's agreed to do in the first part of that paragraph, and it was not found to be acceptable. And the seller may have intentionally accepted an offer with 6C1, knowing their survey is so old or illegible that it won't be accepted by the title company. And so this means that a new survey is going to have to be ordered, buyer's going to pay for it. Because the seller did what he agreed to do. He provided an existing survey. And so as you look at this from the, the seller standpoint, buyer standpoint, you need to understand what you see in those choices there in 6C1 specifically may not be what really is going to happen. What you really want to do is make sure we negotiate appropriately in 6C2 and 6C3. There's an important thing in 6C2, which is both 6C2 and 6C3 deal with new surveys. And it's my philosophy that buyers should always obtain a new survey. The only exception sometimes is acreage. You have a good, fairly recent existing survey because it's so expensive for acreage. But if you're sitting there with a house and a lot on Lakeside on Preston, you still ought to get a new survey. But so you decide on 6C2 or 6C3, and the decision here is who's going to pay for it. With 6C2, buyer's going to obtain it, buyer's going to pay for it. But there's some important language here that kind of on the buyer side gets to be a little bit of a trick. Let's say in 6C2, the buyer puts in there 10 days. And then as the buyer is going through the transaction and they're not really sure how this deal is going yet, and they're still talking to their lender and there's challenges. So they say, I don't think I want to spend money on a survey yet. And so I'm going to give myself a little extra time. So instead of getting the survey in 10 days, and this is the closing in 45 days, I'm going to wait until I feel much better. The property appraises out, we get through inspections and negotiate repairs. So the buyer doesn't actually get a survey until 20 days into the deal. that okay? Or, yeah, because the buyer is not required to do it in those 10 days. But this ties to 6D, the objections paragraph. Because there's language, the last sentence in 6C2, that the buyer's right to object is either when they actually receive it or the time here, whichever is earlier. So he's got 10 days in there, even though he didn't receive the survey for 20 days, his timing for objecting based on the survey ended at 10 days. And so what you've got here is somebody who's saying, yeah, I got 20 days here. And we've seen this over and over again. And if a listing agent is not paying attention here, and the buyer says, well, we object. And they object when they got the survey 20 days after the effective date of the contract. Say, well, okay, I guess you have that right. That's when you actually received it. And then you look at the language. That language was added 2 versions back to the contract because that's what they were doing. Buyers were budging. They were giving themselves additional time because they made a fairly short time frame in 6C2 to help the seller feel better. Says, oh yeah, they're going to get a survey in 10 days, so we've got that resolved, and they don't get it for 20 days. Well, that impacts on their ability, their timing to object as they work through that. So we need to recognize what happens there. Now, if you've got the seller in this situation and he's going through this process, the seller needs to be careful how comfortable they feel about this buyer getting this thing done in the time frame and how it might or might not affect their objections. Remembering in all cases that regardless of the buyer's rights of objection, the seller has no obligation to do anything regarding the buyer's objection. And may give the buyer some rights to object, and then if it can't be cured, they can terminate, but there's no obligation on the seller's part going through that. What you have to be careful of in 6C3 is when we're going to have the seller provide us a new survey to the buyer, and the seller's going to pay for it. You need to make sure, and if you work with the title company or the surveyor, you need to make sure that that survey, even though it's paid for by the seller, is in the name of the buyer. Because the buyer needs that survey done in their name. So they have some rights as they're going to go forward on that survey or deal with any mistakes on the survey and file claims. So you need to make sure you do it. Most surveyors, in fact, I've really not come across any who didn't cooperate with us on this, are fine, regardless of who paid for it, putting the buyer's name on. They know that it's the buyer's looking at, well, that's my survey, regardless of who've already done who paid for it. So you need to look at those choices and succeed in going through the deal with that. Because it really could impact on a lot of things, especially in dealing with the rights of objection, which tends to be very, very misunderstood.
A lot of times.
Question? Yes.
Puts the survey under their name, like their public title, and last time I just reached out to them and then they reached out to the surveyor and then they did a separate one with the client's name on it. A lot of times they.
So did you originally have an existing survey
No, they
Oh.
ordered a new survey
under 6C2 or 3?
and under 6,
Okay, so that would have been in the buyer's name.
but title puts it under their name.
Should always, and that, most of the time, the title company is going to be for you, but the buyer's name should show up on the survey. And even Republic Title, because I had this conversation recently with Kelly at Republic Title. And I said, well, what do we have to go? She said, just, we always make sure the buyer's the one who's protected because it's going to be their survey moving forward. So if they don't have that, you need to talk to them and say, hey, we need the buyer's name on
Yeah, I talked to title and title reached out to the survey.
it. You got to take care of
They corrected it, yeah.
Good. it. Okay, perfect. Now, in 6D, yes, ma'am, question.
So on the survey, so say I represent the seller and they paid for the survey, they put it in the buyer's name and
And they
then.
did 6C3. Okay,
So say they do all that and then for some reason, or some other reason, it never closes with that buyer.
Yeah.
For some other reason, the buyer is terminated.
yeah,
So they paid for this brand new survey.
Yeah.
Is it something that is easy to go to the surveyor and say, hey, can you change the name of the survey the our name now or have
Yeah,
they? paid for it?
this is an interesting situation. Happens more often than you would think, in a couple of different ways. It's gonna depend on what the buyer's gonna wanna do. Buyer's sitting here going, hey, I've got a brand new survey here. Sorry, we didn't close. I'm sorry, I didn't do the deal. And depending on whose fault it is, somebody may be unhappy with each other. Buyer say, I'm happy, seller, for you to have the survey, so you can use it on the next deal. I'm happy we do that, but you're gonna have to get the surveyor to agree. Both surveyors are not gonna have a problem because the seller paid for it. And she went through the process and they'll work it. What the seller probably wants to do is wait until he gets another contract with another buyer. And then have that buyer's name put on it. So sometimes you'll have a buyer on a transaction and the first hint you've got is that title has already been opened. Because there was a previous contract and there may well have been a previous new survey. So you need to, at that point in time, have a conversation with the title company, say, okay, we need to know, who the surveyor is. We need to know, because if we end up contract here, we need to make sure that as we make choices, paragraph 6C, we deal with the survey that's already there and who's gonna end up paying for it. And we need to make sure our name's on it. So it's really smart to look at that situation and have the conversation, because surveyors are gonna cooperate. They don't care. They're getting paid for it. So they're good with it. But it's important for the agent to recognize, hey, here's what's happened and here's how we move forward to deal with it for our client. But you're right, that can be a real challenge.
So Bob, in that situation where a deal terminated after the survey was ordered and it's in the previous person's name, the surveyor just changed the name on the survey,
Yeah,
that's a pretty simple process.
yeah. And most surveyors do it. Telecom tells us it's rare for a surveyor to not cooperate. When a survey company doesn't cooperate like that, they go on the bottom of the list with the title company, because the title company is the one who normally orders the survey. And they remember experience. There's some surveyor companies, for example, that are so user-friendly that if this deal falls apart, although they have a right to have somebody pay for it, they'll say, you know what, we waive it. We're not gonna charge the title company or charge anybody, because that could come out of the earnest money. But just remember us and, come to us for the next deal. But some title companies will totally waive it and they won't even charge you now if the deal falls apart. So it really depends on who the surveyor, and the title company knows those survey companies that are really work with you. American Survey, for example, is one of the ones that does that, but they'll waive it. And so you look for those kinds of things. Now, what's the dirty trick that you might see in paragraph 6D that has a couple of important blanks in paragraph 6D? You get a big blank in there, you get a small blank in there. And so you're creating buyer is saying to a seller, because remember in this whole process, we got buyer and seller making promises to each other, going through this process. And the big thing that the buyer's got to prove out is that this property is in the condition and the value based on what I'm paying for it. And I can do with it what I want to do. And I want to buy it and I want to build a big pool or build a detached garage or rent it out or whatever. And so paragraph 6D is where the buyer can say, I want to make sure I get to do certain things. I want to make sure I can do this. And so they create rights of objections. If the buyer doesn't do that, and the big blank in 6D, if they just totally leave it blank, and the buyer has in their mind some things they want to do, and they don't put anything in there, then there may be things that happen that keep them from doing what they want to do, and they have no right of objection. Because when you look at the very first part of paragraph 6D, buyer may object to writing and defects, exception coming to the title, disclosed on the survey other than items 6A1 through 7. One of those items are easements. It's going to get in the way of them building a pool. And if they don't put in the big blank that they want to build a big in-ground pool, then you don't get to object to it. And it can create a real challenge going through the process. So the buyers, they look through this from a seller standpoint. We're looking for things, sneaky things that the buyer might be doing. What are the things that you think buyer might be doing in paragraph 6D to give them some things that maybe the seller's not aware of? We think might be going on there. It's what are some of the kinds of things that a buyer might stick in the big blank in 6D? Said what I just mentioned, pool. What else?
Pool,
Be able to open a
home
home.
office,
home office.
Airbnb.
Office, Airbnb, rent it out.
daycare out of
A
it.
daycare, yeah. Read a church. So when a buyer does things like that, is their intent here, they don't really care, they're just creating a nice, easy way to get out. Is this something that's gonna really cloud the offer? And from the buyer's perspective, you need to understand that whenever the buyer puts anything in the big blank, that clouds the offer. And there really creates a challenge there. And so you need to look at whatever it is. Now, from the seller's perspective, it's a little bit of a trade-off here. And let's say the buyer puts in there that they want to use the property, want to be able to rent the property out. They want to use it as a rental, not necessarily a short-term or Airbnb, but they want to be able to rent it. And the seller, first of all, is clear with the language in paragraph 6D. They're not obligated to do any research to determine if the buyer can do that or not. That's not the seller's responsibility. However, the seller needs to understand that if they don't make sure something like that can happen, they may waste time off the market with a buyer who's going to end up not closing because the buyer says, we thought we could use it as a rental and now we find out we got to own it for a year to be able to do that. And so if you can't cure this, we're going to terminate the contract, and there are timelines and 60 for that. So the seller has to decide this thing that the buyer's putting in there, what's the intent behind it? Is it just an easy way to get out? Or is it something that the buyer says, this is so important, if I can't do this, I'm not buying this house? So from the seller standpoint, from the listing agent standpoint, your seller needs to do the research and look at whatever it is the buyer's wanting to do to see if that's feasible. As we go through the process, because we don't want our seller to enter into a contract and hold the property off the market for some period of time when they already know that the buyer's not going to be able to do this thing and they're going to go away. And the seller just wasted that time going through the process. Now, hopefully they've negotiated a fairly decent option fee, so they at least get the termination option, be able to move on from that. But they wasted some important days on market in the contract and go through the process of the market.
So the trick would be if the house is in an HOA that doesn't allow rentals, but being able to rent the house in 6D. As a way of creating.
Okay, so this takes an understanding of our timelines here. So in paragraph 6D specifically, now let's say that the buyer wants to use it as a rental property. And that's what he puts in the big blank. And he's got in the small blank in 6D, 3 days. This means that the buyer, after he receives the last of the 3 documents, commitment, exception documents, and survey, he has 3 days to object. And he's created this basis for objection, right, to rent the property. So under the objection paragraph, he's got 3 days, or closing, whichever comes first. But under the HOA, if this is in a metro HOA, and the buyer, and it's the buyer, not you, who checks the HOA docs, who talks to the HOA and determines, buyer says, I can't do this, I can't rent the property. HOA says they've maxed out on percentages of rental properties and I can't do it. Well, the buyer's right to terminate, not to object, but to terminate is tied to the HOA addendum, which we've got in the packet, and 3 days after receiving it for any reason. It's an absolute pure option period. It's a free option period. As a minimum, it's a 3-day free option period. Or if you don't get the HOA docs for 5 days, it's an 8-day free option period. Because it's a right to terminate for any reason, not a reason specific to what's in the HOA docs. They got up that morning and said, oh, we're thinking, what about it? Did you see what's going on next door? People from Oklahoma living next door. We live with that. I mean,
So to further understand the trick, the trick would be submit an offer, the buyer submit an offer without an option period, so it looks great.
yeah,
And then put that in 6D, and that creates an option period for you.
yeah. One of the things that's a little sneaky, even though the buyer has something they want to do with the property, like rent it out, they don't put anything in the big blank in 6D. Help the seller feel a little bit better. Yeah, this is no option period, no objection rights here. It's kind of a committed buyer. But a good listing agent can say to the seller, let's look at other rights termination the buyer has here. They don't have the unrestricted right under the option period, but they have a right to terminate for any reason under the HOA and under the seller's disclosure if that had been produced. So you've got to be able to help that because, sneaky may be too strong a word, but it's somebody who's using their knowledge of the timing of these paragraphs to the buyer's advantage, because frankly, most may be more than it should be, but at least half the listing agents out there have no clue about this. And they say, wow, great offer. And haven't I done it? I've done a good job getting you a good offer, haven't I, for you? You gotta be happy with me. Yes, sir.
So, 6D, if, let's say, someone leaves it blank, right? Then technically this and the HOA timeline matches because if someone.
The two timelines are totally independent. One has nothing to do with the other. And that's a challenge. When we look at this, we look at option, we look at self-disclosure notice, we look at HOA, we look at 6D. We got all these different timelines, and then maybe you've got an addendum with a time frame in it. You got all kinds of rights. They all operate independently. They don't stack on top of each other. They don't relate to each other. And it's really important on the listing side for us to help our seller understand and for us to pay attention to the timelines. What this buyer is really pulling here, you know, what they're doing, because most agents, frankly, a lot of agents really don't pay attention to the timelines. And then they look at some of these things and they say, well, oh, I mean, that, just like you thought, oh, the objection time frame and the HOA time frame, those are exactly the same. Well, they're not. And one has nothing to do with the other. They're totally independent. They don't overlap and don't stack, and they're totally independent. And if they don't have the option and they don't have anything in the objection paragraph, but they still have major HOA, then they've got that right of termination. They don't have to have the others. You work through it. And so, and we've got some buyer's agents out there who really understand this contract. And one of the little things in the making sure somebody's not using them against you is one of the things that we do is we look at an offer. We look at what's in it, and we look at what's not in it. And most listing agents won't understand how important it is, because when you look at what an agent is helping their buyer put into an offer, they're communicating to you how smart they are, how much they understand this. And if they've got a lot of things that are just wrong in there, one of the things that happens is you may be lulled into a false sense of security and say, geez, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. Yeah, I've looked him up and he's been in the business 5 years, but he can't write an offer. It's a terrible offer. He believe he did these things. Well, he just pulled one on you. Because he kind of lulled you into a false insecurity, said, look at that, wow, yeah. He believed he'd do this. Well, he may be doing it intentionally because he knows most listing agents aren't going to be paying attention. And he has to let it happen. So you've got to look at the things that they don't do and then look at all the other things that are in the contract that may impact on this and give them the right to say, well, look what they gave up. Well, maybe they didn't. And it's interesting. When I teach over at CCAR and I do a contract class over there, it's a 3-hour class. And I talk about what people are experiencing with the agents on the other side of a transaction. And the most common thing that I hear is they say, people don't know what they're doing. People write bad offers. Listing agents are accepting bad offers. I mean, they're really not paying attention to what goes into the blanks. They're putting bad timelines. They're leaving things blank that shouldn't be blank. And we'll talk later about the sale of the property addendums, some things that happened there. And agents and other brokers, they're having this happen all the time. And sometimes it's happening because people just aren't paying attention to the contracts. They don't read them. They don't really understand them. But sometimes they're doing it intentionally, causing you to believe that they don't know what they're doing when they know exactly. You have to be.
So they're playing dumb.
They are playing dumb. And one of the most powerful techniques that they make use of is ghosting you. You've got a good contract. You've got a 7-day option period. They've done their inspections the very next day. So 2 days, they've done their inspections. You're feeling good. Well, these people are really committed. Look at what they're doing, spending money on inspection. And it's the seventh day of the option period. You haven't heard anything from them. You reached out, zero, nothing. They've ghosted you totally. And then at 4 o'clock on the seventh day, you get a repair amendment. Are you happy about that as a listing agent? Probably not. You go, my gosh, what's up with these people? You know, and one, you may just think, yeah, they're incompetent on what they're doing. They don't get their act together. Sometimes that's a big producing agents, you know, this is just one of many deals they're doing and whatever. But the reality is, by doing that, you created an environment where if you've got a seller who really needs to do this deal on any level, they're gonna work with the buyer at the last minute, because they don't want the buyer to go away. And they know they've got an hour and then this buyer's gone. And so that type of thing, that silence is a powerful tool as you work through that. And they understand the emotional reaction that they're creating on the other side. Yes, Janet? And
That's why we had the new system in place that they have to respond within 24 hours.
Okay, they don't have to agree to something. They don't have to agree to something.
No, but they have to respond.
Okay, they don't have to respond to what?
If I inquire to them about.
If you've inquired, they've got two calendar days
Okay.
to respond.
Hours. So they can't ghost us too long.
Well, what are you gonna do? And she makes a good point. We did make the change, in 535.2, Texas Rules of the Texas Real Estate Commission, response time. Well, the response time that the broker has to you when we receive things from the commission, and a response time from somebody else in a transaction. It's important to recognize if we got a transaction. In my example, we do have, we got a contract. And so you don't have to agree to anything, but you have to respond. You have 2 calendar days. And that is the law. I mean, it used to be 3, but it's 2 now. But what are you gonna do? Here you've got, you know they've been out for inspections on that second day. You're now on the 3rd day and you're kind of waiting for something. And now you're on the 4th day, you kind of wait for something. So are you gonna send an email out? Maybe says, you know, my seller is anxious, you know, we know you've done your inspections. We look forward to working with you and do that. And they don't do anything. They don't respond to you. You're gonna file a tract complaint?
Oh, the broker first.
Well, is the broker gonna file a tract complaint? What do you hope to accomplish?
I'm simply getting the opportunity to have contact with this individual.
Okay, but here's the thing. You say, you know what? I'll show them. It's been 2 days. I've got documentation. They've not responded to me. I'm gonna file a tract complaint. You just blew your client's deal.
Oh, I'm not gonna do a track complaint.
Well, whoever does, what I'm saying is, even though we've got that calendar date, it brings a good point. They are required to, and it's one of the things that said, hey, you gotta be doing it. And by the way, a good agent will always follow that. I mean, the professional agent, this is really pushed that. But in the practical side of it, when they've done this to you and they're intentionally creating an environment, pushing you to whatever they're doing. By, you know, if you send something out and they say, now, you gotta respond, calendar date, I made a request here. Their response could be as simple as, I acknowledge your request.
I know they're.
At least you know they're still alive, working the process. But the challenge is, and this is the heart of our contract between the buyer and the seller. Remember that totally who it's between buyer and seller. They've made a whole group of promises. It all comes down to enforceability. If somebody doesn't do what they've agreed to do, nothing automatically happens. Somebody may be so blatantly in default. We had this, one of our agents here, had a buyer in a contract. A seller, after being in contract with our buyer, not only entered into another contract, closed it. Closed with another buyer while still in the contract with our buyer. That's blatant. I mean, that's huge. And to the problem is that the seller's listing agent was his mother. I mean, there's all kinds of problems going on in that little deal. And our buyer went ballistic, just furious. Oh my gosh, we're gonna sue them and the horse he rode in on, and now we're gonna, you know, I'm gonna back 17 return. Guess what happened? Nothing. Nothing. There's no point. They already been going, they already done, you know, I mean, just, and the reality is, it comes down to enforceability, it comes down to a response. What happens if they don't? And if they intentionally, and if they're using this, say, you know, I know they know I'm supposed to respond in 2 days, and we haven't yet, we'll wait till the last minute and we'll see what they do. And they can use that against you. So we look at that enforceability, we look at what they're doing. When they do those things, you've got to decide how intentionally they're doing it. Now, sometimes people, in fact, I would say more than often, people are doing it because they're just not competent. They're too busy. They just got so many other things going on. Now, every once in a while, and that's why you want to be a little courteous, and I know you always will be. You find out after the fact.
I love how he's staring at me.
No, yeah. But and we've had this, we had one of these, and fortunately, our agent didn't get all excited, didn't get upset. And we didn't really know about it until the buyer kept trying to get in touch with our agent, the listing agent. And listing agent said, why is the buyer calling me? And, you know, and he was getting ready to say to the buyer, said, you know, I can't talk to you, you got to talk to your agent. And he actually said that, but he said it respectfully, and the buyer said, what did the buyer say, by the way? Anybody know? I've talked about this before. I said, I'd love to. I can't.
Can't get old.
I can't. He's dead. The buyer's agent had a heart attack 3 days ago and was dead. Heck with the response time. You got a whole new challenge here as you work through this. So sometimes we have to be a little curious, and that's one of our mottos, anybody. Curiosity, you know, going through the process. So I'd be a little curious and say, well, I need to find out what's really going on before I yell and scream at anybody. And then, yes, sir.
So in 6D, if someone has wrote something like Airbnb or pool, we should make sure that we put that these many days after the buyer have received, otherwise they have the rain check till closing date, they can.
Yeah, if the buyer has something they want to object to, they've got a number of days, that number of days is their timeline for objection. And if they don't object during that time frame, they've lost that right of objection.
Yeah.
So you need to help them understand that timeline and what they can do there.
And if that is left blank, then they have to closing date, right?
Yeah, here's the problem, and this is happens so too often. Most of the time it happens because people don't understand it, but sometimes they're very sneaky. If we leave the small blank and 6D blank, and you just brought the point, we have had both sides of this. You've had the buyer who says, you know what? That number of days is a limiting number of days. I've got all the way to closing to object. And the seller said, no, it's not a limiting number of days. You don't have any time to object because it's blank. You always have to have a number in there. Otherwise, you have a potential dispute between the buyer and seller. We don't know what it means. We can't even get attorneys to agree what it means. We'll see how a bigger deal it is in paragraph B of the sale of property addendum, how that blank in there is really impacted. That's a kick out paragraph. We'll talk about that and explain. But when you see something that is important information, important timeline, and it's blank, and you got seller, you need to know what that might mean to your seller. Because a buyer might well take the position and have an attorney who would support him, say, hey, yeah, you've got all the way to closing, because there's no limit here. And then it's gonna come, who's gonna push harder? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to make sure I
Me
understand.
too. I've always wondered about that.
And forgive me for my ignorance,
Oh.
but I just want to make sure that I understand the relation between the C1 and the CD
Yep.
and this blank for two. So like, say what you were talking about earlier, and they put it,
So you're looking at 6C2.
I'm looking at 6C1.
Okay.
And I'm looking, and I want to look at that first. So say I do like you said earlier, and I put the 10 days in there and I say buyer's expense.
10 days where?
Within 10 days after the effective date and 6C1, okay? So I say I do that and I check buyer's expense, okay? So if I do that, and then I go down to 6D, and I put 3 days in the two.
And so
6D.
it's small blank in 6D.
Say that
You put 3 days in there.
Yeah, we put 3 days in there.
Now, is that tied to the effective date or tied to the receipt of information?
It's tied to the receiving information.
Yeah, the last of the three.
Yeah.
Commitment, acceptance, document, survey.
Right,
And you've given the seller 10 days to do the existing survey.
so if I do that and say they do it and it's not acceptable, okay?
But
Because,
they don't have one. As the seller said, I don't have one, or it's not acceptable,
right,
and the buyer's gonna pay for a new one,
right.
in your example.
So if they do that, that buyer has no later than 3 days prior to closing. So if I put something in the objections and I put 3 days in the 6D2, since it says and the survey as far as when they receive, does it basically mean
Yeah.
we have all the way almost to
You're
closing?
pulling 61 and 62 together,
So I need to like totally,
separate, because those are mutually exclusive. So if you deal with existing survey, and it's a good question that you work through, existing survey, and you give him 10 days. And once he's done it, and let's say he did it and it was not found to be acceptable, so the buyer's gonna order a new survey. When the buyer orders up, gets a new survey, which as he worked through the process, once the buyer receives that survey, which is typically, in this case, gonna be the last of the 3 documents in 6D, that's when his 3 days or closing, whichever comes first, comes into play. So he doesn't get to extend the closing date. So when the buyer, let's say the buyer got the information and seller said, you know what? Here it is, and the title company says not acceptable. The buyer says, well, I'm gonna order up a new one. And so the buyer gets a new one 10 days. So we're 10 days after effective the contract. So the buyer now has title commitment, the survey, and exception documents. At whatever point he gets it, he now has 3 days to object, if that's what you've got in the small blank, or closing, whichever comes first.
yeah, and I guess.
It's in 1 day before closing, he's got 1 day.
Right, and that's what I'm saying, I guess that's what I'm asking, so like if it doesn't work out in C1 and they end up having to to purchase a new survey, the
Yeah.
buyer has to do it.
Yeah.
And they choose to wait, like they're not getting that survey until let's say 4 days before closing,
It's okay.
okay? That gives them, because of the line that says buyer receives commitment exception documents as a survey, that gives them all that extended time
Yep.
to get out of this contract
Yep.
because they haven't actually.
Not only all that time,
Yet, correct?
but they also have that after they finally receive it, let's say 4 days before closing, then they've got the next 3 days to object.
Right, so that,
Not to terminate, but to object.
okay,
To object.
okay,
An important distinction. This just creates a timeline for the buyer to object. So here we are, we've got 1 day now prior to closing, the buyer has objected. He said, I'm finding out that I can't use it for a rental and I object. Well, the seller now has 15 days to cure the objection.
okay,
And the seller and the buyer are not getting along with each other. And the seller says, you know what? You knew this stuff. You had this stuff down, 2 weeks ago, and you're waiting till the last minute. Well, guess what? I've got 15 days and I'm gonna take it. Because the seller can extend the closing date for their 15 days. The buyer cannot extend the closing date for their time frame for objection. So when you pull something like that, you have to be prepared that the seller may say, I know you expected to close in a couple of days and get to move in, but guess what? It's gonna be 2 weeks. Because you can't make the seller do anything. The seller's got that 15 days to make a decision whether he's gonna do anything or not. So you have 15 days, say, now I think about it, I'm not gonna cure it, I can't do anything. So buyer, what do you wanna do? Now, the buyer has 5 days after that time frame, that 15 days, to decide that they're now gonna terminate or not. So you've got to be comfortable with the timelines in 6D and the objections, however many days the buyer has to object, how many days the seller has to cure the objection, and then how many days after that, which is 5 days, the buyer has to either accept or decide they're going to terminate.
so if the
It's not an
buyer,
automatic right to terminate.
the buyer really wants this property, there's no advantage to them as far as waiting.
Yeah.
With this kind of delays.
Here's exactly what really happens is buyers say, I'd really like to be able to do this, but I love this property. If I don't get to do this, I'm still gonna buy the property. So I'm gonna waive my objection, seller can't fix it, and then we're gonna move on.
Okay, thank
Thank you, good question. Thank you, Mike, for being here. Another Zoom. I understand. It's always one more.
Before you move on, can I ask a protocol question?
A protocol?
So once upon a time,
Explain protocol to me.
how you should do it in an optimal situation.
Okay,
So let's play like we don't have a multiple offer and we've got a traditional.
who are we, seller or buyer?
For the buyer. 7-day option period and the inspector doesn't come out for 2 days. I know you can get one 24/7, but that's the way it was. My buyer is naive and they freak out about everything and we have to get other contractors in to prove up an estimate for repairs. The seller could and should know otherwise. He ghosted me until 4 hours before
He
the seller,
Buyer.
the seller.
Okay.
The buyer, the listing agent ghosted me, could not be reached. He knew that we were going in and out frequently. And he didn't respond until I sent over a written repair amendment. So he obviously wanted to see what I wanted before he picked up the phone. And then he had an attitude about I sent it in 4 days before.
This game's unhappy.
The listing agent was, yeah, he's so busy, so important, so very important.
Yeah.
And he was
You're taking his valuable time.
4 hours before the opt-in period is over.
I've heard that about you.
Well, he's way more important than me or my buyer or this contract, and he let me know. But the point is that, let's say he didn't respond, let's say he did have a crappy attitude. What is the fallback position? They don't have to do any repairs, or we have to extend the option, or what?
Yeah, it's a good point, and it happens a lot. We've had questions where sellers, for example, and listing agents, question what the seller's obligations are during the option. Because that's when we're gonna go through this negotiation. And in your case, where you're not getting, good response, and you got an agent on the other side, it's real pain. You've got to look at the other parts of the contract, and what other rights are there, for example, for the buyer. One of the things that you have to do for your buyer is protect it, and you have to do this for every single point of right of termination in the contract. Because you've got it, and the biggest one, and the one with the most leverage is the option period. So as you're closing in on the option period, you've got to say to the buyer, worst case scenario, we don't hear anything from the other side. Are you still willing to own this property under these conditions? Is the property in the condition and the value and everything that you want it to be, that you're able to do it? Or is your thought here, if the seller is not going to agree with me and at least negotiate these repairs, we're out of here? You've got to have your buyer ask themselves that question. They've got to go there. They're losing an important point of leverage as you work through that. And so you've got to help them understand it. Now, you look at other points and say, you know what? This is just one right of termination. We already have in this contract other rights termination. So it's no big deal if we can't get the seller to work with us, the listing agent to work with us. Except that if you let this go by with this kind of a listing agent who's a little bit pompous and all that kind of stuff, when later you continue to try to negotiate repairs and you try to say, we still have rights termination, so you need to work with us. They didn't really pay attention to that, and they didn't let their seller know that the seller really needed to work with the buyer. And you get a little ego going there, and they get in the way of the deal because they have an expectation of when things should happen. And so you've got to be reading what's going on with them, because in that case, it may be a dirty trick because of just who they are, how they do business. This creates pressure on you and your buyer to do something within a time frame where they expect this to be done. Not required to be done, but it's going to impact on how you're able to negotiate the transaction. And you've got to read that. You've got to see what's going on the other side in both ways. The agents who are successful in creating a good relationship between the agents, everybody's working together, moving forward. Those are the deals that are going to close. Those are the deals that are going to get passes. When you deal with an agent like you're talking about, you've got to find a way to work through and around their egocentric, way of doing business for your client. to the point that you say, you know, here's what could happen. But
So,
you've got to ask your buyer a question. How do you want to own this property? Are you willing to own it? If we can't get the seller to do anything at all, do you still want to own the property?
so if you replayed that, you would just let the option period lie as is with no repairs. But you'd continue to let the listing agent know that you have the other rights to terminate and the repairs would still be requested.
Yeah,
Excellent, thank you.
yeah. It's going to come down to how you're able to communicate. And you do that in a professional manner as you would go through the process. You know, I really appreciate you working with us on this. Our buyers really had some challenges getting all their stuff together in the right timeframe. Fortunately, as you know, we have other rights of termination. So our buyer will continue to move forward and try to work with your seller on repair so we can get this thing done. And you'll do it in a
What are
really,
the other rights of termination?
do what?
So what are the other rights of termination? Yeah, like in your scenario, would it be the third party financing? What if it's cash? So-
Yeah, seller disclosure, HOA. If you have any addendums like sale of the property, anything of that nature, third party financing, you mentioned financing. You, from the day one, when you look at an offer, you represent the seller, are you looking by either side?
You're right.
You gotta look at all the contingencies, all the things that create leverage situations. And those are the big ones, but there's smaller ones, and you just gotta have a sense of it. Remember, all we're talking about here is a buyer and seller making promises. And if they don't keep a promise, what's the consequence? What kind of rights does it give the other party to work through? Makes semi-sense? Yes, sir.
I had a question, spoke earlier about paragraph 7. It's kind of disclosure, the paragraph
7B,
7B, and then they check.
which ironically is the very next point we're about to get to.
Yeah.
But your question is, go ahead.
Because I had got an offer this week about, they checked that box.
Okay, so you have a seller,
I had a seller,
okay?
Yeah.
And they checked off what?
they checked B2.
Okay.
Buyer has not received the notice. But
Okay.
So my question was, they said whenever they do that, basically that opens them, they can come out of the contract within the 7 days, correct?
After they receive it,
After they receive it, so.
for any reason,
For any reason.
and not a reason specific to the seller's disclosure, but literally any reason. I got there more and said, don't buy this house. We're in a time frame to get out. They don't have to tell you the reason, they don't have to explain it. Just have that right of termination, because that's one of the boxes checked on the buyer's notice of termination contract. Correct, from your form.
What if the seller's disclosure is in the documents on MLS and they just,
That does not constitute that you've delivered it to the buyer.
that doesn't.
No, having MLS doesn't do it.
So then,
And here's the overriding factor, what's in the contract. If 7B2 is in the contract and you represent the seller, you allow the contract to go live with 7B2. They just picked up a minimum 7-day free option period.
right. Well, can I say?
So your seller, you need to understand that. So your
Right.
seller says, well, we're gonna counter this. I'm gonna have you send them the seller disclosure notice. We're gonna change 7B.
That's.
Yeah.
Can do that.
Absolutely. But here's the thing. Your seller says, if you're gonna counter anyway, seller says, I'm gonna count price or terms or whatever. Then this is a perfect time to do this. But if your seller says, I don't wanna rock the boat here. This is a great offer. More than I ever thought I'd get. You say, okay, you can accept it, but you need to understand what they just picked up, 7-day free option. And if you're willing to live with that, then that's okay. But we're going to go ahead and accept the offer, be in a contract, and you're going to immediately get that over to them. And in this case, we'd like for the buyer to sign that sales disclosure notice, even though the law does not require it. We'd like to them to do it, so we've got the timeline. So we now know when that 7 days starts. So it's going to start when they receive it.
So they're not required whenever.
Buyer is not required to sign a sales disclosure. Seller is, but the buyer is not.
Because I was always the impression that.
You know why buyers are signing sales disclosure notice? They said, you know what, I gotta have it. Max won't pay me a commission, but I don't have that dang time. And the bank says, who's Max? Yes, ma'am.
So on my seller's disclosure notice, so say, the listing agent sends the seller's disclosure notice. but the notice is dated, let's say it's today, okay? And let's say that notice is dated July 2023. So it is on the old form, it's not on the new form that supposedly after September 1, blah, blah, blah. So so at that point, do you just go back and say, hey, can you have your seller, fill out the updated form or?
Yes,
How do you approach?
they're not required to.
So,
It's good for you to be aware of the difference in those two forms. Fortunately, the previous one, the 23 before September 1st, had all the floodplain information in it, had all those questions. Very few changes from that one to the September 1st, frankly, it was only dealing with the pit. The pit comes in the 611, 6011, so and if it's not in the pit anyway, doesn't really matter. So while you can request it, the buyer would be in a tough position to require the seller, so you need to use the most correct form, the most current form, as you work through that. It would be good to think. The differences in those two forms are not so huge from a legal standpoint, depending on what's going on in the transaction and a bit. Your bigger problem, where I thought you might be going on this, and this is a little bit of a dirty trick, is that the seller didn't do a great job of completing the seller disclosure notice. A lot of stuff incomplete, a lot of questions not answered. And so you're gonna provide this to your buyer and you're gonna say, there are things in here that the seller didn't disclose and he really needs to. Well, the property code really reads, and most attorneys agree with this, that if the seller didn't do it according to 5.008 of property code, they've not made the notice. They've not completed the notice and they've not delivered to the buyer, and the buyer has termination rights. But the buyer's got to decide how big a deal is the seller's disclosure. Some buyers say, you know what? I don't care. I don't care what the seller says. We're gonna do inspections anyway. Some other buyers say, I'm gonna nail that seller to the wall. They better give me the right information or I'm gonna get them. Because seller disclosure notice is a big part of almost every lawsuit out there.
yeah, I'm kind of going with multiple things. One, the part about, so I thought, I could be wrong, that all contracts closed after September 1st were supposed to have the current.
Should have, because that was the new seller disclosure.
Yeah, also the part about if it was incomplete, but also say the seller disclosure notice is dated in July, but since that time, a house has gone on the market, it's gone off the market, they've done repairs, and then they haven't gone back and said, hey, these were issues that were found. They're just saying, oh, I have this inspection report, and oh, I have this briefing, and I have this.
Here's a challenging situation. This is a little bit of a challenging situation. Seller, when he does seller disclosure notice, it's what the seller knows as of that date. After the fact, when things happen, the seller is required to disclose to the buyer things about the condition of the property. They're not required to update the seller's disclosure notice. Property code doesn't actually state that. It simply says the seller must disclose to a buyer what they know about the condition of the property.
Okay.
Now, Texas Realtor has a one-page form that you can use to update the seller's disclosure notice. So if a seller has new information, after they originally completed this, they had a new roof or their foundation or whatever, they really should update and they really should provide this information to a buyer. A buyer can hold them responsible for that because they've not, although they completed a seller's disclosure notice at whatever date, and let's say that was on September 15th, so it's past the date and it was on the correct form, but since then, they've done things. And so, they can't be required to create a new seller's disclosure notice, but they are required to provide information to the buyer. Here's new information about the condition of the property. Now, if this happens after a contract is executed, and now the seller says, oh yeah, I've got some new information here, I'm gonna update the seller disclosure notice, and they use the technical form. Most attorneys agree that when they do that, provide to the buyer has a new 7-day right of termination timeframe, because they've got new information on a seller disclosure. And that gets to be a little tricky thing. So we get down to having a conversation with our buyer, saying how important is this. Now, you also have a conversation on the listing side. Talking to your seller, about, hey, you know, we really need to provide this information, need to do this. So I said, no, I filled it out. I know that's all I'm required to do. Then you guys decide if you're willing to continue to move forward and represent that seller. Because what we understand is when a lawsuit hits the seller, it also hits us.
Okay.
And so we'll be careful of that.
Thank
Does that
you.
make semi-sense?
Yes, sir.
So in paragraph 7B, one of our challenges in 7B in dealing with this, the dirty tricks or what they do. We have investors who check off 7B3. And why do they check off 7B3?
There.
Yeah, so we never lived there. In fact, we've never seen a problem. Bought a side, haven't seen it. So we're on the list. We don't have to do one. Well, they do. They still have to do one. They're not on the list of 11. And so you need to be careful from the seller side when you receive what might otherwise be a good offer. And they made a choice at 7B that they can't make. And if you let this thing go live with 7B3 checked off, this may be negligence on how you represent your seller. So you need to see when they, and we have this happen with investors. We have this happen with people. Simple example, guy inherits property of his uncle. Now, if he's the executor in a will, he's on the list of 11. He doesn't have to do a seller's disclosure. But if he's now inherited the property and owns it, he just went off the list and he has to complete one. He says, that's crazy. I've never even seen the house. I live in California. I'm glad to have inherited it. Put it on the market, sell it, send me money. He still has to complete the seller's disclosure, even though he may never have seen the property and not have any question. He needs to tell us what he doesn't know.
Can you paraphrase that again? So if they're just the executor and do.
They're on the list of 11.
They're on the list.
They don't have to do it.
If they inherit it and now are the.
And now own it. They have
They
to do it.
have to do.
Yep. So it depends on who they are when they're the seller. Are they an executor, are they a trustee, or have inherited now on the property? So it depends on who they are. So we have to be careful when they check off in 7B, which one are they checking?
I took a class, who was the instructor? I can't remember. She was somebody out of Houston, recently. And she was saying that, whenever she sees this part where the seller is not required to furnish, she says, a lot of times she will send the list of the exemptions over. Yeah, about 11, and say, hey, can you tell me which one is applicable?
Yeah.
And is that something that you think is a good idea?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Because you're using a third party, you're using factual information, saying, you know, appreciate your offer, great offer. I was a little curious because your buyer checked off 7B3. Which of these, you know, do they think that fits, you know? Yes, ma'am.
I go a little further on the title and say, is a trustee John Knoll, trustee is Elizabeth, and they'll confirm it that it's gone.
Says you really are a trustee, and that's gone through probate. Yeah, sure.
They're a great title, a great.
Yeah, that's a great reason. Yep.
Most likely will open title because there's a lot of documents
Yeah,
before they sell it. So that's a good.
that's a good point. Yeah. It keeps them from using the sneak on you kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just relying on
Yep.
the
Their word.
agent, yeah.
So you're absolutely right as you kind of work through that. So as we go through, we're looking at all this great stuff. In paragraph 7D2, I really am curious. This gets to the as-is conversation. How are you dealing with the buyer, for example, and that's where you typically get the question, where the buyer is coming to 7D and he says, okay, I'm buying it as is. I don't get to do inspections. Well, yeah, you do. That's in paragraph 7A. What do you mean I'm accepting it as is? I don't even know now. Janet?
My explanation is always, the verbiage says as is, and I educate them on what that means. That means with your naked eye and my naked eye, knowing none of us are engineers, none of us are electricians, plumbers, etc. With our naked eye, you don't see anything that requires repair up front
That you know about right now.
that we know about right now. However, if we go through a house and we see broken windows, we see half the roof missing, we see there's absolutely no air conditioning system whatsoever, we may consider then writing into paragraph 2 there, that there are some items we would like addressed from the immediate upfront, because if the seller signs your offer, they are now required to make these repairs. Whereas if we send them a repair amendment later, they have the option to either say yes or no.
Yeah. That's right, because there's an important part, an important principle of the as is. And it's that no one is obligated to do anything that's not in the contract. And what that means is the buyer can do inspections to their heart's content under 7A. But the seller is not obligated to do any repairs that are not in the contract. And in Janet's point, if the buyer says, we noticed a crack in the marble in the entry, we want that fixed, and he puts it in 7D2, then the seller is now obligated in the contract to do that. But if they don't have anything in 7D2, if they check off 71 and say, yeah, accept as is, and then the buyer does their inspections and finds all these kind of problems, except for the buyer potentially fussing at the seller for failing to disclose things, it feels like he may or may not have disclosed, the seller can't be required to do anything, and the buyer has no termination rights based on the seller not agreeing to do repairs the buyer asked for.
Unless he's in the option period.
Well, unless he has other rights of termination. Now, the option can be anything else, but it's important to recognize, I don't care where, I don't care what their timeline is. If they're in the option period, they have rights of termination based on that particular specific termination option. So that just gives them that right of termination. But when a buyer says, well, I've done an inspection and here are all these repairs that I need for the seller to do, or I'm not willing to own the property. And if the seller doesn't agree to do these, we're going to terminate the contract. That might be the reason they're going to terminate, but it's not a basis for termination. It doesn't give them a right to terminate. They have to have some other right of termination. Now, if they were sneaky and they went ahead and did a no termination option contract, they may have other rights of termination, but they don't get to terminate under the termination option because they didn't have one. So they better have some other right of termination. If they've got a cash transaction and they already have the seller disclosure notice, it's not a mandatory HOA, they may not have any rights of termination. They may be stuck on this deal. But the agent is going to help and say, here's your leverage, here's what you have and what you don't have as you work through that. But just with the seller not agreeing to do things for the buyer doesn't give the buyer any new or additional rights, termination or otherwise. And remember, neither party is required to agree to the other party's request to amend the contract. So when the buyer says, well, we gotta do this, you gotta do these repairs.
Question.
That is a right, as you go through the process, when you agree to do all these repairs, that's a promise the seller is now making, which he hadn't made before, as you go through that. And that actually relates to the paragraph 2 of the amendment form, relates to paragraph 7A to repairs 7F in the contract. So it's important for us as people try to do this, sometimes intentionally pulling this stuff, sometimes they just don't know better. But the end result can be the same for your client as you work through that. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I understand what you're saying about the obligations part. But so like, if I am representing the seller, I mean, obviously, I would think having nothing in D7D2 is better, obviously. But if I am representing a buyer, obviously, different things are important to different buyers, obviously, and stuff.
Sure.
But by putting some things in that blank.
And 72, something specific,
in
very specific.
I'm putting something specific in there. Is that in the end hurting their negotiation power?
This is where you come into play.
Just kind of.
One of my phrases, the big picture. You've got the big picture.
Okay,
As an agent, you know the impact of putting something in 72 on the negotiation. You may say, you know, right now, when we're making this offer, we know about this right now. Now, it may be that the seller has already disclosed to you and you already know that you're gonna have to put a new roof on. So the buyer may address that in the contract, say, I'm not gonna worry about negotiating that later, we're gonna do right now. So that may be something that works out okay because it's already been talked about. But anything you put in there could cloud the offer, and you've got to help the buyer decide, as you've got the big picture about how this is gonna impact on other negotiations. Which means it has to be something important to the buyer, and the buyer has to have a good negotiating leverage. If you're the first warm body to show up in 6 months, you probably can get away with that. If you've got 5 other offers you're competing with, then this may cloud the point that it really impacts on the offer. But you as the agent are the one that has that information.
Okay.
Advise your client.
Okay,
They need to understand that you're the one that's gonna help them understand, yeah, do that or not do that or whatever.
Well, and the seller can counter your offer.
Sure, oh yeah,
You can scratch that, number one.
yep, absolutely. Where you find, by the way, in 72, a sneaky trick, and I've had agents on the listing side accept them, they shouldn't. Is they put phrases like, you know, per lender required repairs. You don't take it, can't do it. But we see it in there. Or based on inspection, based on structural engineer, based on, you know, whatever. Can't do it, has to be specific. Specific repair. Because if it's otherwise, both agents, and this is a Trek thing. Trek says, we don't care who originated the phrase. Both agents are responsible. If you, the listing agent, allowed your seller to sign off on an offer that's got bad language in it, you're as responsible as the buyer's agent. Don't let it happen. You work through that. Makes sense? Anything else on 72 before we go to 9A? One of the interesting things, by the way, and I don't have it on my handout here, but in 7F, which deals with repairs, and we got new language in there, one seller's gonna pay for transfer warranties, and so has to provide, you know, the receipts, which they never had to do before. We still have challenges, and you need to really make sure you've got good communication, both sides. If you've got the buyer's agent and the seller's agreeing to do repairs under a repair amendment or whatever, we need to make sure everybody understands seller can't be doing these repairs. Big reason, one of the big reasons for the more detailed language in 7F is because we were having sellers do repairs. And unless the buyer and the seller agree to allow the seller to do repairs, they can't do them. So we need to make sure that they're not being sneaky on the side. I mean, there are times in which it's, the buyer says, yeah, it's okay. The guy owns the AC company. He's maintaining the AC for his house. And that's his business. Yeah, you know, we should agree what's gonna be done. We're good with that. But where you have is where the sellers, it's fine to GFCIs, you know, not a big deal. You know, I see new, you know, a drain pan for the AC. I can go down to Home Depot and get that, no big deal. And so, you know, may still be able to do receipts, but you notice who it says has to be doing these. License, if a license is required, and a lot of a roof license, a foundation license, a lot of important repairs, there's no license attached to it. So if they're licensed or otherwise, this is their business. This is what they do. And by the way, it's been held that that includes handymen. And or women, as the case may be. But if that's their business, that's what they do all the time, they can probably get away with it. What we find ourselves with handymen sometimes is they'll do electrical work, but they'll have an electrician, a master electrician sign off on it. And that's probably okay. That seems to work out well. Big thing is we want to keep the seller from doing this. You work through that.
I have another question.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry.
Okay, please.
Okay, so for the receipts, so if someone provides a receipt, let's say for plumbing, okay, and
Yeah.
it was, I don't know, $1,500 for
Yeah.
plumbing. And it shows the itemized bill of $1,500, but somebody has just written on the invoice paid.
Yep.
As if I'm representing the buyer or even representing the seller and having to give this information, do I really need to be saying, hey, we really need something from this company that shows a zero balance, not just somebody wrote paid?
Now,
Or are you trying to call the company and say, hey? can you
here's what's
verify this was
important.
paid?
More important, or shop than seller. This was an improvement on language. It needs to be a little better. When you look in the middle of paragraph 7F, and we're talking about provide buyer with copies of documentation from the repair persons. I think the buyer needs to go beyond that. Legible copies of paid receipts. And you need to have a timeline before, don't be at closing looking at this stuff, prior to closing. So the buyer says, hey, this is what we agreed to do and I don't have this. Because what the buyer needs is some enforceability here. I mean, this is better language than what we had before, but the buyer needs to think through this and say, hey, here's what I really need. Because even some of these licensed people, plumbers, electricians, you can't read their stuff. $1,500 done. They have no idea, but I think to follow up from the buyer's aid standpoint, checking out these people, you need a good company name there. You need to be able to verify with them. And if you got any warranties, especially things like roofers and foundation, ACs, you need to call the companies to make sure they're still in business. Not just that there's a referable warranty or transferable warranty, but these people are still in business. And we see this really with foundation companies. And so you've got to be on top of that. These are things that you, as you point out, these are things you want more than just the minimum that you see here. Right? If you see here, here's $1,500, somebody wrote on it paid, really?
I'm not very trusting. I don't
No.
think anybody can write paid on.
You know, I've heard that about your son. Yeah, just kidding. But you bring up a good point. Your buyer, you need to, as a minimum, let your buyer know, says, it's good that we've got this, but my recommendation is we take some extra steps. And your buyer says, that's a good idea. Your buyer says, no, don't worry about it. We're good.
Okay, thank you.
Client gets to make the decision. Paragraph 9A, which deals with, the handout deals with the closing date. You need to be paying attention if the other side is playing games with you on the closing date and they're coming up with a closing date just because it looks good. You need to really, this is that big picture thing for your client, seller and buyer. Your seller, the closing date may be incredibly tight and important because they've got to close, get the money and go to their builder's home. And the time frame is really tight. And if something happens and the buyer needs another week or whatever to be able to close, may just totally kill your seller or their deal. Because they may lose their earnest money because they can't close the bill deal. Same thing on the buyer. The buyer may be homeless if we can't close in time. So whoever your client is, you need to understand the timeline and their situation and how much flexibility they have or don't have for closing, and funding and possession. You need to absolutely be asking those questions, working through it. Because people will set up closing dates just because that looks good, you know, that's, we still, by the way, negotiate closing dates. We like the middle of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We like weeks that are in the middle of the month, second, third weeks of the month. We don't like the last day of the month. We don't like the first day of the month. We don't like Mondays. Not that the tile companies are out partying all weekend. They're crazy on a Monday. I don't know. Yeah.
I never set them for Mondays or Fridays.
Yeah, don't set for Mondays or Fridays, if at all possible. Friday afternoons especially, I mean, that's death. Just stay away from Friday afternoons. Because what happens is your buyer expects to be able to use that weekend and move in, and funding doesn't happen Friday afternoon.
That's right.
And you got a big problem. You may say, well, we got a guest room, I guess you can still.
Well, and don't forget to tell them to take the key out of the lockbox. They don't.
Yeah, once we get all that walkthrough and everything done. So you've got some real challenges with the closing date. Make sure everybody understands, because they can be creating a closing date just because it looks good. It's gonna make you sign a contract, and it may not be what they're gonna do. And we've got one right now. We have a seller, and the buyer wants to change the closing date from a Friday to a Tuesday of the following week. And our agent is trying to work through the situation, and our seller needs to be able to close on that Friday because we're leaving the country. and they won't be here the next week to be able to close. And sometimes remotes, when you're in a different country, it can be a real challenge to work through it. The buyer has requested a change in the closing date. It's an amendment, item number 3 on the track amendment. And the seller's concern is, do I have to agree to that? Because it's not a good thing. What the buyer could do, by the way, is just not close on that Friday. Wait and close that Monday and Tuesday. It's almost certainly reasonable time. The contract didn't just die on that Friday. It didn't just go away. It's still live unless the seller took some action and defaulted the buyer, and that would require an attorney letter. Buyer say, you know what, I'm gonna wait, and we're gonna go ahead and close Monday, we'll close Tuesday. If you don't close, seller, you're in default, we're gonna come after you. There are those other pieces of that thing that you ought to understand, because that's why you're gonna say to your seller system, there's some challenges here, so you need to get some legal advice on what you need to do here. So, well, I'm not gonna be in the country, we're gonna work something out, a remote closing or power of attorney, or work through something, because just in case you, and this is the buyer who, and interesting, both buyers are from the same area of the world, in the Middle East. And there's some cultural dynamics going on there that are creating some real challenges. And neither of the agents are from that area of the world. So they're just trying to keep these people at peace to some level and work through that. But you gotta be able to work with that.
Now, I've seen it scenario. Is it
Yeah.
possible for the seller to go to title, sign, and then the buyer show up on Tuesday and sign and.
Sure, we can do that, yeah. So the seller can go ahead and do their part first, and then Tyler can work with them, and then do the buyer on that Tuesday. So there are a lot of different options and things here, but that's gonna take the agents getting with the buyer and the seller to work through and say, let's see how this thing can be done. Now, let's throw a little complication in it. Our seller also has a backup. So this thing doesn't close on that Friday, does that kick in the backup contract? That's a legal question, but you're not gonna answer. As you work through that, so there's always one more thing as you work through that. And the harder you've got this backup buyer pushing, say, well, hey, this contract didn't close on time, and work through that process, so we want the deal. It's gonna be an interesting challenge. We're still in the middle of this. Trying to work through it. We've been,
Some just holidays.
yes, in fact, that's why the sellers are going to this other country, because of a religious holiday. They have to be there for that. Yeah. Yeah, and so the backup buyer in this situation is willing to work with our seller for a later time frame to be able to do it, which gives our seller a lot of incentive to get rid of this first buyer and go to the backup.
Do they have to indicate in their offer or anything in special provisions that due to potential religious holidays,
You have to close.
a closing may be pushed, or is there a way to?
Yeah, I don't know how you deal with future events like that. I mean, obviously it'd take attorney language,
Yeah,
but other than that, that'd be an interesting challenge. Yeah. Paragraph 10, possession. What kind of sneaky thing can people be doing with possession? Because you really only have two choices, don't you? Closing and funding or temporary residential lease, which would be buyer temporary lease or seller temporary lease. Rarely ever buyers, but so what kind of sneaky stuff is going on in paragraph 10 that you have to watch out for as you work through it?
They're closing and funding, but they're not actually leaving the house. I mean, when you're supposed to.
Yeah. Yep. And agents who intentionally set up a closing for late Friday afternoon are playing possession games. You need to be prepared for how that's gonna impact on your client, either side. So you gotta watch that.
and our understanding of being able to take possession is not until the money has entered the
Yeah.
seller's bank account.
Our challenge is, we don't have a really good definition for funding. We kind of look to our title companies and say, well, when we have, the authority to disperse funds, Malcolm says, in our opinion, that's fine. We had exactly what you said. We had the seller. And it was the Friday afternoon closing. And the seller closed, buyer closed, and seller hit the road on the way to Phoenix. And the funding, the money didn't get to the seller's bank account until Monday. And the buyer said, well, we closed, we funded, everybody signed off, we want the keys. So I said, until I see the money, and it's in my account, this thing ain't funded. Well, there's nothing in the contract that says that. I mean, you know, the buyer and the seller can be in a dispute, and we'd have as many attorneys on one side as the other saying, well, no, that's what funding means or doesn't mean. The buyer probably would win in that case, but that's gonna be down the road. I mean, right now, the buyer's sitting there homeless, they need to get into the house, they need to work through the process. Well, we ended up in that particular situation, the buyer fortunately wasn't gonna be homeless, because the seller just dug their heels in and said, you know, till money's in our account, they don't get to keep, they don't get to move it. So we've got to try to avoid that dispute, because it can be a challenge. We just don't have a good, clear definition of what the heck funding actually really means.
What's the problem? What's finding the clear language?
Pardon me?
What's the problem with finding the clear language?
Attorneys in the legislature. They'd have to agree to it, so we can put something in the contract. There's a tendency on both the Broker Lawyer Committee and the legislators to not regulate principles. As you begin to put language in there like that, you're making interpretations about what we think it means it's going to bind the principles. And there's a tendency for them not to do that. Whether they're right or wrong is a different conversation. You notice that we don't have paragraph 11 in our thing? Why are we not talking about paragraph 11? She's smiling and said, I know why, Bob. We don't want to deal with it. Stay away from it, right? Just stay away from it. There's all kinds of crazy stuff can happen in paragraph 11.
We used to do a lot of that.
Oh, we do a lot of it. The thing that I still see in paragraph 11 with an FHA or VA buyer, we can't use the addendum for, you know, the appraisal addendum. And so they'll have an attorney create language for them, put in paragraph 11. If the VA buyer says, if there's an appraisal gap, we'll pay the gap, we'll pay the difference. And what that's doing is that's creating a dispute between what's in the contract and what the federal law says. And almost certainly the VA law would prevail. So you need to really advise your seller. Says, I know the buyer's saying this, we've done a proof of funds and the buyer really has the money, he can do it. But push come to shove. I mean, if you've got a simple little situation, $400,000 sales price, and the buyer's agent says, yeah, I'm gonna CMA and it'll probably appraise, if not, it'll be very close. And the buyer says, okay, I've got the money, I can do it. Let's put the language in paragraph 11 and let's get this thing into a contract. And then the property appraises for $350. A $400,000 sales price. I said, no, I'm not gonna put $50,000, no way. And they rely on the federal VA law, and he said, there's a mandatory clause, you know, we're not gonna do this. It probably would prevail. The big problem is that the agents didn't advise their client how much of a risk there is here, the agent would be found negligent. Yes, ma'am.
Well, 4C on the third party financing, I thought it does say if for VA anyway. If VA financing is involved, a buyer elects to complete the purchase at an amount in cash from a source which the buyer agrees disclosed. Saying he can elect.
He can elect to, he can, but he doesn't have to.
Right.
That's the key. That's the difference. A buyer of both FHA and VA, see it more on VA than FHA, can pay for that difference. He paid more than that. And you ignore the appraisal and the VA, the certificate of value, you can ignore that. But they don't have to. And they still would be able to get out of the deal. There's a word to it. But we don't know.
And
What's the rule?
About FHA.
Yeah, I'm saying, we know we don't want to be the test case. But we're not gonna advise our client to go down that road. Paragraph 12, specifically 12A1B, seller's concessions there, where the seller's gonna pay money to the buyers. Here's the sneaky trick. If you're in a negotiating situation and the buyer leaves 12A1B blank in the first offer, but maybe it's the third counter offer. People tend to just paying attention to certain pages. I think you're negotiating back and forth and ignore other things. And that can be really sneaky. They can cost agents money. Paragraph 14, even though you don't have any choices there, you've got some challenges with, what happens when there is a casualty loss, storm comes along, damage to the roof, whatever. The seller is providing intentional misinformation, to lead the buyer to move forward. And often this may be things like dealing with the insurance company, adjusters, things of that nature. Manipulate the deal. Because you got a buyer that really, really wants this property. We've had properties totally destroyed. And as they work through the process and try to deal with the insurance, it gets emotional and gets tricky pretty quick. Paragraph 20. Paragraph 20 deals with FIRPTA. And what is FIRPTA?
The thing where if somebody is a foreign person and they sell, then you have to like.
They're a foreign seller. Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely correct.
It's a foreign, it's not, it's foreign and they.
Tax liabilities.
Right, they have that taken out of.
And if they have tax liabilities that are not resolved at closing, whose responsibility is it? Buyer. IRS will hold the buyer responsible.
Where does the seller get the certificate of non-foreign status?
Pardon me?
Where does the seller?
At closing. At closing, the title company will give, there is a certificate from the IRS that you can have it and send it to the title company prior to closing.
It's from the IRS.
Yeah,
So
we don't have a check form for that. It's an IRS.
how do we know to ask the seller that when we're taking the list?
See, this is our challenge. Well, we actually, in the listing agreement, have the question about are you a foreign seller? So we have that in the listing agreement. Our challenge is, buyer would want to know, wouldn't they? This is a foreign seller. You wouldn't, as a listing agent, put it in MLS. I've got a foreign seller. Without the seller's permission. Because you could impact on buyers. You may reduce this showings for the buyers who say, wow, I've heard about this problem, man, I don't deal with that. Could really impact them. But we don't have any simple, easy way to get that information from the seller to the buyer. But as a listing agent, because we have the question in the listing agreement, you're gonna talk to the seller, you're gonna make sure they resolved it, they've done it. On the buyer side, it's a little trickier because you can't ask select listing agents about sellers. They say, well, I can tell by their name. I know they're a foreigner. I can tell. I can tell that. That's a gift I have. It's not a problem. Well, you got a problem. Now you can't ask, but you have to ask every listing agent for every property buyer's interested in. Because your buyer would reasonably want to know, wouldn't they? They want to know, do I have a foreign seller? And if they got this worked out, got it resolved or whatever, you'd want to know. But this is a challenge. And sometimes sellers say, oh, no, not a foreign seller, everything's good, I'm paying my taxes, everything, whatever. And they could literally be giving me correct information, manipulating the situation. What we have to do is make sure we talk to the title company and see how involved they're going to be. Some title companies are totally hands-off. So you know what, that's a buyer and seller problem, not our problem. We're not going to do anything other than they got to sign a document at closing saying they are or not a foreign person, that's it. And so you've got to be able to make sure that good title companies will work with you. To look out, good title companies will understand their obligation. Many title companies in their information that they get from the seller and buyer will have that information. The good title companies, when they're closing, they have the document They'll even help the buyer fill out the document that has to go to the IRS. Because the buyers have a certain time frame. If it hadn't been resolved at closing, they've got to get that to the IRS. And the IRS will hold the buyer responsible. And, you know, buyers say, well, you mean I'm gonna have to pay the seller's taxes? No, because the money is withheld from the seller's proceeds. So the tax liability of the seller comes out of their proceeds. Your risk is in when the seller doesn't have proceeds that can cover that, then you've got a problem. Paragraph 20 can be a mess. It's really gonna come down to the title as you work through that. Paragraph 21, notices, not a big deal. This is just where, remember our rule? You, the agent, always have to have your email, and they've got, in paragraph 21, they've got that place where you put CC. Your email has to be there, because we don't want our client to get a notice that we don't know about. So we want to make sure that information is there.
If you're using a transaction coordinator, please put their email in there as well.
Yeah, put their TC in there.
Just multiple eyes, help them watch for everything.
Absolutely. Sure you do that. 22. We don't have a lot of intentional screwy things going on in paragraph 22. What we have is offers that are made and they don't check off the box for third-party financing, but they include the addendum. Or if they do check off the box and they don't include the addendum. I see this happen more with HOA addendums, where they checked off the box and the addendum's not there. You need to be sure that's done correctly, because the way something gets to be an actual addendum to the contract is it's checked off in paragraph 22, checked off, 21, 22, it's checked off. This and the actual inclusion and signatures on that addendum makes it an addendum to the contract, makes it a viable part of the contract. Without that, you begin to have a dispute on who has obligations under the addendum. So if you don't have it checked off here, but it's sent along, it probably with signatures, it probably becomes part of the contract just because it indicates the intention of the parties. But if you don't have it checked, if you have it checked off, if you don't include it, and it becomes a big question, well, that was just a typo as you work through it. So you need to make sure that what you have in paragraph 22 really reflects what's going on in the contract. Broker information on page 10. We need to remember, this is not part of the contract. This is information. The contract ended on the previous page. And when an agent puts something in that, but the last paragraph, if you broker agreed to pay other broker a fee, this doesn't mean anything. Not enforceable. What's in MLS or what's in an agreement between broker is what's enforceable.
Oh, page 10, is that?
Yeah, page 10, broker information. Yeah.
So if it's not filled out,
Well, if it's not filled out, that's better than putting the wrong information in there, because we're still gonna rely on what's an MLS or agreement between brokers. That's gonna determine what the listing broker owes the buyer broker. So we wanna be careful, because sometimes, you'll have buyer's agents stick things in that particular paragraph, thinking that, I mean, maybe they've got 2% MLS, well, no, I want 3%, and they stick 3% in there. And reality is, it doesn't mean that. They don't get 3% unless they've got an agreement between brokers that has that 3%. Work through that.
If you're doing an intermediary, you just keep that blank, right?
Yeah, in an intermediary, there is no other broker. So there's nothing that goes in that line,
As I see people keep that 3%.
No, that doesn't need to have anything in there. You're exactly right. An intermediary, because there is no other broker. So on page 10, only the right-hand side gets filled out. So, you know, buyer and seller is intermediary, the left-hand side doesn't get filled out at all. Everything is on the right-hand side. And you don't put anything in the blank. You're exactly right. Because we don't have an other broker to work through that.
Great question, Tish. I've been here 13 years and I've never known that to be zero.
Never know what?
Never known to not put something in there on intermediary. That says that you're always gonna learn something.
Same broker.
Makes sense.
Pardon me?
If it's the same broker, fire.
If you just, well, you complete the right hand side. She's got it right, your right hand side. First, listing agent's top, was agent's bottom, and then broker make the thing at the very bottom, leave it blank. Because there is no other broker. It's all just a listing.
Yeah, two agents, same broker.
And I've always filled out the right side. I've just been out of habit putting the down there without even thinking.
See? Go. Good.
For the listing, and the left side is for.
The left side is where, notice what it says. Well, there is no other broker. There's only one broker representing seller and a buyer. So nothing, in an intermediary, nothing happens on the left side. You only fill out the right hand side and you check off seller, buyers, and intermediary.
Mhm.
And you don't have anything at the bottom because it says agreement to pay other broker. Well, there is no other broker, so that stays blank.
Might want to make, you know how remedial I didn't know for years that intermediary meant two agents with the same broker and it could only exist that way. That's really simple. Just think of two agents in their own brokerage,
Yep.
right?
But you now know
Well, I know that now, but I'm sure other people are as remedial.
one agent, a broker representing both sides. But that's only after they've had a conversation with me.
That's
So how do we handle the intermediary here, let's say, bring the seller and buyer, so how do
You won't represent both sides.
okay,
You'll only represent one side. You'll have to have another agent represent the other. But if you've got anything that looks like intermediary, phone call to me. If you want to call the agent hotline and talk to one of them, and they'll say, yeah, here's how that works, and if you've got a question, call. You should never have one agent in the middle representing both sides. So intermediary is enough of a challenge anyway, when you stick just one agent on both sides, totally neutral, no advice or opinion to anyone, that's a disaster. Who loves intermediary are plaintiff attorneys. They know they're gonna catch somebody. Is word through.
and so intermediary or not, it doesn't matter, we can leave that be as a blank because whatever is in the evidence, that's gonna prevail, right?
Say that again.
So I'm saying that if it's, let's say, a normal case, it's not an intermediary, right?
Yeah.
In that case also, even if you leave that broker fee as a blank,
What you should have in that broker's fee is whatever's in MLS.
if it's.
Or an agreement between brokers,
That's right.
or agreement between brokers. If it's intermediary, nothing. Like you could just stick in there NA. So we know there's no other broker. This is right, you don't put intermediary, you don't put a number in. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to say before people start trickling out as we get close to 3 o'clock, next Tuesday at 1 o'clock, I'm teaching a buyer's class.
Ah, okay,
What do you say? What do you do? What paperwork do you have?
good. You're talking about the buyer's rep?
Yes, how do you fill out the paperwork?
Good.
Next Tuesday,
What time? 1 o'clock?
1 o'clock on the 19th.
Okay. That's good to know. We are, you got, just like last time, a lot of good questions, good conversation. Third-party finance dinner, which should be the next thing on your handout. As you have there, the challenge we have in third-party financing, is when people go through the process and, to make something look good, they misrepresent what the financing is. Remember what this is. In paragraph 3B, you've checked off third-party financing addendum. We've actually where we have down payment, financing, and sales price. And you've done that, and those should always match. What you've got in paragraph 3 should match what you have on third-party financing. And as you go through the process, you have to understand, except for paragraph G, other financing, which is designed for hard money lenders, nowhere in the contract or in the addendum do we represent or state who the lender is. While we hope that the buyer who gives us a nice pre-approval letter, that's who they're going to continue to use, very often buyers shift and change to other lenders. They need to understand there's nothing that keeps them from doing that. They need to make sure that they're going to go ahead and respect the other terms of the contract, such as the closing date. It's a whole other class that we have and we've done. What happens when it's a cash transaction, they change the financing. What happens if it's a conventional financing, they change FHA or VA? And we'll deal with that, because that's a whole new kind of situation. The addendum for, the appraisal, which is the addendum for the buyer's right to lender appraisal. We've already talked about the FHA VA situation. You need to have a good understanding of what people are doing in, the three choices, really 1 and 2. One is the buyer saying, we don't care what the gap is between the sales price and the appraisal, we'll pay it. Well, if you got the listing, that looks good, but you need to do proof of funds. You need to really have the money to be able to do that. That's what you're promising to do. You also need to understand the difference between 1 and 2, that in 2, you're saying we'll cover the gap, but only to a certain amount. But when you look at number 2, you need to understand what they're agreeing to there. If let's say it's a $400,000 sales price, and they put in number 2, they'll sit there and say $390,000. Well, they're promising to take a gap of $10,000. So if it appraises for less than $390,000, they get out of the deal. They won't do. So you need to understand what it is. Now, number 3 is not a waiver. Number 3 is additional right of the buyer that gives them control over the lender. Because you may have a problem, maybe you've got a buyer who's making a large down payment. Say 50%, $400,000 sales price, paying $200,000 down, and the property appraises for $390,000. And the lender says, let's see, gonna loan them $200,000, property appraisal $390,000, yeah, that's good. That's good collateral. We'll make that loan all day long. The buyer says, whoa, I don't want to do that. I don't want to pay $400,000 for a property just appraised for $390,000. If the buyers check number 3 and put the proper numbers in there and they've got an appraisal to give to the seller, they can terminate the contract, regardless of what the buyer decides, what the buyer's lender decides to do. So if you've got a buyer putting a large down payment, then you can deal with that and work through that process. Make sure you understand this right, this addendum only addresses the appraisal, not any other condition of the property. And so when you look at this and you relate it to third-party financing, and paragraph 2B deals with property approval, the only thing this addresses is the appraisal, not the condition of property, not letter required repairs, not title issues, not anything else, only the appraisal. That's all it's addressed.
And this can only be done with conventional.
Conventional, that's the only type of financing dealt with, not FHA or V, not any government loans, only conventional. You're exactly right. I don't want to rush through these last several here. I tell you what I think we'll do. In my class next month, I'm going to talk to Lucy about which day I want to try to have it on the 16th, which is Tuesday, maybe the 30th. I'll finish up these, but our next class is going to be dealing with multiple offers. Because we're now seeing multiple offer situations, and it's been so long since we addressed it. We're having agents, particularly listing agents, having challenges with what they have to say to buyers agents, and what they have to do in handling multiple offers. So we're going to touch on that and address that, and we'll finish this off there. Does that seem reasonable? Is everybody okay with that? Right. We're not going to rush through these last couple. Great questions, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you, Zoomers, being here.
Thanks for your time, Bill.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody go back and enjoy their spring break.
Yeah. I want lots of college.
That is, huh?
Thank you.
In here, appreciate it.